I'm trained as a journalist, and in journalism we learn objectivity. And of course, Sicily is just one place I cannot be objective about. And the time that I've spent there was really a life-transforming moment for me. In many ways, I think so much of the world now is becoming more and more the same, and we see that even in many areas of Italy. And you can find areas of Italy where you can go into a supermarket and find olive oil made in China, cheap olive oil made in China. But Sicily, I believe, has really kept its soul intact. To me, it's a magical place. And a thought came to mind the other day when Ciro, one of our winemakers, was saying he had started reading the book Eat, Pray, Love. I noticed how the author had gone to Rome to eat, and then she went to Sicily and she said, "Oh, I just learned there how tough life is." Well, to me, Sicily is one place you can eat, pray, and love within 20 minutes of your time at the airport. You don't have to go anywhere else. And what I love about Sicily, what it's taught me is there isn't eating, praying, and loving. It's all the same thing, simultaneously. And that, to me, is really the beauty of Sicily and its way of life. And I'm going to read a passage that's towards the end of the book, and it's sort of the culmination of my travels there. The next day was my last in Sicily for some time. I planned to meet a man who worked for the local Forest Service and had a small vineyard in Passacucciaro, from which he made a wine that was a local legend known as il vino cosmico, the cosmic wine. Pietro is not entirely of this world, warned Frank Cornelison, something I took as a strong recommendation coming from Frank, who is himself often considered from another realm. Frank's not with us tonight. He's coming in tomorrow, so we can talk about him. At 5 in the evening, as I drove to Passacucciaro, the sun appeared, a white obscure disk in a wet sky. At the local cafe, I met Giuseppe Zingari, a Sicilian who had worked for Frank the previous winter, but was now a caretaker of others' vineyards. Giuseppe, who had his 2-year-old son and baby carrier in his car, would lead me to Pietro and his cosmic vineyard. I followed Giuseppe through our Corria. We turned off the road onto a dirt trail with parallel tire tracks that snaked through the shada of rough boulders scattered with almond trees, wild olives, and macchia. We stopped in front of a small stone cabin surrounded by fruit trees and a garden plot that still had the last dying traces of that season's tomatoes and zucchini. Standing in front of the cabin, Pietro Primi was thin, medium height, with hazel eyes and smooth skin covered with white-flecked stubble. His most noticeable feature was a healthy head of dark, wavy hair that, combined with a face that is free of any apparent stress, made him look much younger than his 55 years. He wore a thick white button-up shirt, baggy brown corduroys tucked into tall brown rubber boots, and a gray canvas hunting vest. Pietro was handsome, but as he smiled brightly with his eyes, I noticed that his lips remained puckered inward. Pietro has no teeth. He invited us into the cabin, one room with a cement floor. There was a cot along the back wall next to a corner fireplace, some tin and wood cabinets, and some wooden folding chairs. On the walls were a few paintings of people and places in the countryside, made on canvas and paper, bunches of drying herbs, a rusty antique axe, and a pair of coiled extension cords. In the center of the room sat one wood table crammed with nuts and pieces of cut bread, and bottles in varying states of emptiness, which seemed to contain, or to have contained, red wine. Pietro picked a small, half-smoked cigar off the table and rolled it between his fingers. A bachelor, Pietro lived most of the time in his family house in Randazzo with his aged and ailing mother. But when there was work to be done on the farm in Arcadia, he lived here in the cabin with 7 cats and 2 canine mutts. From behind my head, I heard a barely perceptible tapping and turned to see that on one of the cupboards was a gray mole climbing the side of a live trap. "That's a little friend I'm going to transfer to another place," Pietro smiled, his mouth widening to an O. Pietro led us back around the house, in through another door, and into a tiny cellar no bigger than a 1-car garage. The room was filled with an old-fashioned Palmento that Pietro had himself replicated here 20 years earlier. At the back of the room was a rectangular cement basin about 3 meters wide by 2 deep. The mouth of the basin was covered with thick, worn, and purple-stained boards. Pietro explained how it all worked. Here, each year, Pietro gathered friends for the harvest. The grapes from Pietro's small vineyard were placed on the boards as groups of men, women, and children with rolled-up handcuffs did rhythmic barefoot dance in the fruit while someone picked up a guitar and played something gypsy-sounding, or Pietro breathed out a melody on his flute. As they danced, the juice dripped down between the boards into the 1,000-liter vat. When the juice stopped flowing, the must was piled into a mound and more boards were placed on it. About a half dozen of Pietro's merry harvesters lent their weight to the task of pressing, balanced on the boards while holding on to each other or the wooden rafters. More purple juice flowed. At the end of the day, all the pressed skins were swept into the vat below to begin fermentation. A day or two later, a thick valve at the bottom of the basin was opened and the fermenting juice spilled out into a smaller vertical vat sunken in the ground. The pumice was squeezed in an old wood basket press, and all the juice was placed in a 700-liter chestnut barrel that Pietro would transport by truck to an old barn stall in Randazzo. The whole process was, by the standards of modern winemaking, rustic, laughable. Forget temperature control. Pietro didn't even use a thermometer. In the last light of the day, Pietro walked us out toward his vines. At the side of his house was an orange tree laden with fruit that was now deep green. Further on was a persimmon tree, leaf bare and dangling its yield like small, brilliant red pumpkins. Pietro took a knife from his pocket and cut into the shriveled skins, handing each of us an open fruit with oozing sweet flesh. As we devoured them, he led us to a garden faucet to wash the jammy stickiness from our hands. We walked up the entry road past almond trees and larch and ilex oaks. The ground burst with color from knee-high red valerian, a flowering herb used for centuries as a natural sedative, yellow cavolicello blooms, and wild cyclamens. Pietro had bought this land nearly 30 years before. The vines were tall, trained along cordon wires strung between concrete posts. A small vineyard had been planted for mechanization, but under Pietro's stewardship had fallen back into being worked by hand and fed only with garden compost. Pietro evidently did not share the same perceptions of Albarella vines for Foti and his Vigneri, but he was every bit as much a man formed by Etna and its soil. Standing amid the vines, we spoke of Il Vino Cosmico. Pietro laughed, twirled the unlit cigar in the air, and explained how the name was coined after one long night of feasting and drinking with friends up on the mountain. On that night, several years earlier, there were about 20 people gathered outdoors by the light of a fire when Pietro stood to speak. I had drunk quite a bit, he admitted. I spoke about the vines, humanity, the sun, the wind, Etna. Each word spoken with a flourish, rising to a crescendo. In Italian, it sounded like this: Le viti, l'umanità, il sole, il vento, Etna. I spoke about the vines, my wine, and the cosmos, because I do believe there is a correspondence. And then I said, Il Vino Cosmico. Pietro showed that hollow, toothless smile once more and repeated, Il Vino Cosmico. The Sicilian countryside remains still enough that a man can say something in a fit of drunken inspiration that follows him around for life and becomes his epitaph. We walked back to the cabin, feet tamping through the damp earth. The origin of wine is to drink normally in family without all this raffinatezza. Pietro waved the cigar hand toward the sky. I had never, up until that moment, thought of the word refinement in the way Pietro was using it, to describe fine wines as a novelty. I find what's happening to wine now all a bit distorted. I see it as something stupido. While Giuseppe's son slept in the car, the three of us went inside Pietro's cabin. Pietro walked over to the fireplace and removed an improvised tin cover that had been placed over the opening. Behind was an assortment of incongruous jugs, bottles, and jars, showing contents of different colors. Pietro searched among them until he pulled out one clear wine bottle filled with a light cherry-colored liquid. Pietro rarely bottled his wine. Most of it went into jugs and was drunk within the year. But here was one of the two remaining bottles of his 2006 wine, Il Vino Cosmico. He brought out some tumblers from a cabinet and set them on a table, uncorked the bottle, and poured. He saluted. I didn't expect much. The wine was fruity and quaffable and dissolved at the back of the throat with a prickly citrus afterburn. There was nothing that made you want to burst forth with comparisons with Burgundy or Barolo, but somehow it made you want to drink more. It was less harsh than Fotti's Vinieri, and it was less extracted and ripe than Frank Cornelissen's Rosso del Contadino, but it was from the same family of old Etna wines. Giuseppe and I cracked walnuts and ate them whole, and I watched as Pietro took some and put them in a little hand-crank mill that turned the nuts into a powder, which he spooned into his hollow mouth. A black and white cat jumped on his shoulder. Soon the glasses were empty and refilled. I asked how much alcohol was in the wine, and Pietro shrugged. He found a miniature glass hydrometer in a cupboard and dropped it into a tumbler full of wine. It was a strong 14.5%. Giuseppe smiled. You could drink 3 bottles of this easily. I thought of the months I had traveled from one end of Sicily to the other, of the cellars, vines, helicopters, aristocrats, entrepreneurs, and foreigners. After all that, I'd ended up with a man who at this moment seemed the wisest of all, St. Francis without even a molar to call his own. Giuseppe drained another glass and grinned. The more you drink, the better it gets. He was right. Pietro refilled our glasses again with wine that could never be for sale because then there wouldn't be enough for Pietro to drink with his friends the rest of the year. When the bottle of Vino Cosmico was finished, we walked outside. The sky was glowing with a purplish haze, empty. Looking north, the lights of the town of Malvina, perched on a hillside a mile away, appeared like the only stars in the night. Pietro lit his cigar stub. He had one more thing he wanted to tell me, and it was this. The fact that we have left one epoch for another so quickly. He cupped the fingers of his free hand, pressed his fingers to the center of his chest. That is something that bothers me a lot, truly, inside. Sicily and change was an inevitable subject, even in places where it has little changed. Certainly, Sicily seemed to be in a good period. It was free. It was an optimistic part of the 21st century. It had young, smart people who, little by little, were building resorts and spas and golf courses and sophisticated restaurants and making great wines. Yet it seemed to be only a matter of time before, like much of the rest of Italy, it would lose something. I thought of the bridge that would connect Sicily to the Italian boot and the continent, and an endless supply of fashion outlets, fast food, and doubt. Sicily, I thought, is Italy's last stand. In Sicily's heart, she must know this.